Some bonds are forged not in joy, but in the shared language of loss. When 8-year-old Kaya found 2 orphaned mountain lion cubs crying beneath a fallen tree in 1880s Arizona, she recognized their loneliness because it matched her own. Her mother had died just months before, and the Apache elders said wild things should stay wild. But Kaya believed the spirits had sent these cubs to fill the empty space in her heart. She raised them in secret, hidden in the desert canyons, away from her tribe and the white settlers moving into their land. The cubs grew strong and beautiful, but loving something wild in a world that fears it comes with an impossible choice. What do you do when saving what you love means letting it go forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the red cliffs of Canyon de Chelly in shades of copper and gold, casting long shadows across the Apache village where Kaya had spent all 8 years of her life. The familiar sounds of awakening, dogs barking, children laughing, women grinding corn, should have brought comfort, but instead they reminded her of what was missing. Her mother's voice would never again call her name across the dusty courtyard. Kaya sat cross-legged outside her grandmother's wickiup, absently fingering the turquoise bracelet that had once adorned her mother's wrist. The smooth stones felt warm against her palm, and sometimes she imagined she could feel her mother's pulse still beating within them. Grandmother Naya had given her the bracelet on the day they buried her mother, whispering words in the old language that Kaya didn't fully understand, but felt in her bones. The spirits speak through beauty, her grandmother had said, and your mother's spirit lives in these sacred stones. Now, 3 moons later, Kaya wondered if the spirits were truly listening. The village felt different without her mother's gentle presence, harsher, more uncertain. Even the desert wind seemed to carry warnings instead of songs. Kaya, child, come help me with the morning meal. Grandmother Naya emerged from the dwelling, her silver hair braided with red cloth and feathers. Despite her 70 years, she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the desert's moods. Her dark eyes held depths of wisdom that sometimes frightened Kaya with their intensity. Yes, grandmother. Kaya rose obediently, tucking the bracelet beneath her woven shirt. She had learned not to display her grief too openly. It made the adults uncomfortable, as if her sadness might spread like sickness through the camp. As they prepared corn mush and dried meat, Naya studied her granddaughter with concern. The child had grown too quiet, too careful, as if she feared that speaking too loudly might invite more loss. Tell me about your dreams, little one. The spirits often speak to us when our hearts are heaviest. Kaya stirred the cornmeal slowly, considering. She had been having strange dreams lately, visions of golden eyes and soft fur, of creatures calling to her from the deep canyons. But dreams were sacred things, not to be shared lightly. I dream of Mother sometimes. She's always walking away, and I can never catch up, Naya nodded gravely. The dead must journey far to reach the spirit world. Your mother wants you to know she arrived safely, but she also wants you to stop chasing shadows and live among the breathing. Before Kaya could respond, her uncle Ashki strode into their camp area, his face set in its perpetual expression of stern disapproval. He was her mother's younger brother, a respected warrior who had taken on the responsibility of guiding Kaya since her father had died in a cavalry raid 2 years prior. His intentions were good, but his patience was thin. The child spends too much time in mourning, he announced without preamble, ignoring Kaya as if she were not present. She needs to learn useful skills, not waste away dreaming of the dead. She is learning, Naya replied calmly, not looking up from her cooking. Grief is a teacher too, brother, perhaps the most important one. Ashki's jaw tightened. Grief won't help her survive what's coming. The white men grow bolder every season. Their cattle eat our grass. Their fences block our sacred places. We may need to move again, and I won't have a weak-minded girl slowing us down." Kaya felt heat rise in her cheeks but remained silent. Uncle Ashki meant well, but he saw the world only in terms of strength and weakness, survival and defeat. He couldn't understand that her mother's death had not made her weak. It had made her different, more aware of the spaces between the visible world and the realm of spirits. "Leave her be for now," Naya said firmly. "She will find her path when the time comes." After Ashki departed with a grunt of dissatisfaction, Kaya helped her grandmother prepare the morning meal in thoughtful silence. Around them, the village continued its daily rhythms. Children chased each other between the brush shelters, women tended cooking fires, men prepared for hunting and gathered to discuss the increasing pressure from territorial authorities. Kaya's best friend Zuma appeared at their fire circle as the sun climbed higher, her round face bright with curiosity. At 9 years old, she was a year older than Kaya, but treated her with the protective affection of an older sister. "Come with me to gather piñon nuts," she suggested. "The trees on the south ridge are heavy with them this season." Grateful for any excuse to leave the camp's oppressive atmosphere, Kaya accepted eagerly. She collected her gathering basket and followed Zuma up the winding trail that led into the higher canyons. The two girls had walked these paths since they could barely toddle, and they knew every hidden spring, every cave, every place where the sweetest berries grew. As they climbed, Zuma chattered about village gossip, which young men were courting, which girls who had spoken out of turn at the last council meeting, what the old women whispered about the strange lights seen dancing in the southern desert. Kaya listened with half her attention, the other half attuned to the desert's subtle communications, the warning cry of a hawk, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the way the wind carried different messages depending on which direction. It blew. They had filled their baskets with nuts and were resting in the shade of a large boulder when they heard it, a sound that made both girls freeze with instinctive alertness. It was a low, mournful crying, almost like a human child, but with a wild edge that spoke of creatures who had never known the comfort of human touch. "What is that?" Zuma whispered, her eyes wide. Kaya was already moving toward the sound before her conscious mind caught up with her body. Something in that desperate crying called to the emptiness inside her chest, the hollow place where her mother's love used to live. She pushed through a tangle of manzanita bushes, following the sound deeper into a narrow canyon she had never explored. There, beneath the massive trunk of a fallen oak tree, she found them. 2 mountain lion cubs, their golden fur matted with dirt and fear, huddled together against the red sandstone. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Their eyes were barely open, and they moved with the unsteady wobble of creatures still learning to navigate the world. The larger of the two, a male with distinctive dark markings around his eyes, was trying to shield his smaller sister from view. "Oh," Kaya breathed, her heart clenching with recognition. These babies were orphans, just like her. Somewhere nearby, their mother lay dead, killed by hunters or soldiers, or the simple cruelty of a world that had grown too dangerous for the wild things. "Kaya, we should leave them," Zuma urged, grabbing her friend's arm. "Mountain lions are dangerous. Even babies can carry disease or bring their families revenge." But Kaya was already kneeling beside the terrified cubs, her mother's turquoise bracelet seeming to pulse with warmth against her wrist. The male cub hissed weakly at her approach, but his sister pushed forward with desperate hunger, drawn by some instinct that recognized Kaya as a potential source of salvation. "They're starving," Kaya murmured, gently extending her hand for the cubs to smell. "If we leave them, they'll die." "That's the natural way," Zuma replied, but her voice lacked conviction. She could see the tender recognition in her friend's eyes, the way Kaya looked at these orphaned creatures as if seeing her own reflection. Kaya carefully lifted the smaller cub, a female with fur like honey in sunlight. The tiny creature was so light she seemed to weigh nothing at all, but her warmth was real and vital against Kaya's chest. The male cub protested his sister's capture with a sound that was part growl, part whimper, but he was too weak to do more than voice his objection. "I have to help them," Kaya said quietly, the certainty settling into her bones like winter cold. "The spirits led me here. Mother's spirit led me here." Zuma stared at her friend for a long moment, reading the determination in her posture, the way she cradled the cub with the same protective tenderness she had once shown her mother's turquoise bracelet. "You can't bring them back to camp. Uncle Ashki would have them killed immediately." "I know." Kaya's mind was already working through the possibilities. "But there are places, secret places. The canyon where the old people used to hold ceremonies before the soldiers came. There are caves there, hidden from the main trails. It was a dangerous plan and both girls knew it. The sacred canyon was a 2-hour walk from the village, through terrain that could be treacherous in bad weather. Keeping the cubs alive would require regular feeding, constant vigilance, and absolute secrecy. If they were discovered, Kaya would face severe punishment from the tribal council, and the cubs would certainly be destroyed. But as Kaya looked down at the tiny face nestled against her chest, she saw her own desperate need reflected in those amber eyes. These creatures needed her in a way that nothing had needed her since her mother's death. For the first time in months, she felt the hollow ache in her chest fill with something besides grief. "Help me carry them," she said to Zuma, gently lifting the male cub. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." Zuma sighed deeply, recognizing the futility of argument when Kaya's mind was set. She had seen this expression before, the same stubborn compassion that had driven Kaya to nurse injured birds, to share her food with stray dogs, to sit vigil beside dying elders when everyone else had given up hope. "This will not end well," she muttered, but she took the male cub from Kaya's arms, marveling at his softness despite his wild nature. "But I suppose if you're determined to break every rule our people have about wild animals, you'll need someone with sense to keep you alive." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, 2 Apache girls made their way through hidden paths toward an ancient sanctuary, carrying in their arms the beginning of a story that would challenge everything their people believed about. The boundaries between civilization and wilderness, between love and wisdom, between the world of humans and the eternal realm of wild spirits. 2 weeks had passed since Kaya discovered the cubs, and they had grown from helpless infants into playful, energetic juveniles who could barely be contained within the hidden caves of the sacred canyon. What had begun as daily visits to feed, them scraps of meat and goat's milk, had evolved into an elaborate routine of care that consumed most of Kaya's waking hours. The female cub, whom Kaya had named Aicha, life in the old language, had developed into a curious, affectionate creature, who greeted Kaya's arrivals with purring that sounded like distant thunder. Her brother, darker and more cautious, earned the name Itsan, Eagle, for his habit of perching on high rocks to survey his territory with intense golden eyes. "They're getting too big," Zuma warned, as she watched Itsan stalk a lizard with the focused intensity of a born predator. "And too bold. Yesterday Aicha tried to follow me when I left. What happens when they decide the canyon isn't big enough anymore?" Kaya didn't want to think about that possibility. The cubs represented the first joy she had felt since her mother's death, and the idea of losing them created an ache in her chest that rivaled her grief. Instead, she focused on the immediate pleasure of watching them play, marveling at how quickly they were learning to hunt small prey and navigate the rocky terrain. Her peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching horses and urgent voices echoing off the canyon walls. Kaya quickly herded the cubs into the deepest cave, using hand signals she had developed to communicate the need for silence, then crept toward the canyon's rim to investigate. Below, a hunting party from her village was tracking something through the brush. Uncle Ashki led the group, his face grim with determination as he studied broken branches and disturbed earth. Behind him rode 3 other warriors, including Elan, a young man barely past his naming ceremony whose shy glances at Kaya had not gone unnoticed by the village matchmakers. "The tracks are fresh," Ashki called out, pointing toward a cluster of boulders near the canyon's entrance. Whatever killed Morrison's cattle came this way. Kaya's blood turned to ice water. Morrison was one of the white ranchers whose spreads had gradually encroached upon Apache hunting grounds. If his cattle had been killed by mountain lions, every large cat in the territory would be hunted without mercy. "Could be the same cats that took Peterson's calf last month," suggested Joaquin, an older warrior whose scarred hands spoke of many battles. "The white men are offering good money for every lion pelt." "Money we could use," Ashki agreed grimly. "With the government threatening to move us again, we need every resource we can gather." Kaya pressed herself closer to the rocky ledge, straining to hear more. The idea that her cubs might be blamed for attacks they hadn't committed filled her with desperate panic. Aicha and Itzan were still too young to bring down cattle. They could barely catch rabbits. "These tracks are different," Elan observed, kneeling to examine the ground more closely. "Larger than what we've been seeing. This is a full-grown cat, probably male, judging by the paw size." Relief flooded through Kaya, followed immediately by a new fear. If there was an adult mountain lion in the area, it might discover her cubs and view them as competition for territory. Adult males sometimes killed cubs that weren't their own, especially during lean times. The hunting party spent another hour searching the area before finally mounting their horses and heading back toward the village. Kaya remained hidden until their voices faded completely, then hurried back to the caves where the cubs waited with the patient trust of creatures who had learned to depend on her completely. "We have to move you deeper into the mountains," she whispered to Aicha, who was playfully batting at a feather Kaya had brought as a toy. "It's not safe here anymore." But even as she spoke, Kaya knew the impossibility of her situation. The cubs were growing too large to carry, too active to hide effectively, and too dependent on regular feeding to survive in a more remote location. Worse, her prolonged absences from the village had begun to attract attention from the adults. That evening, as Kaya helped her grandmother prepare the evening meal, Naya fixed her with a penetrating stare that seemed to see straight through to her secrets. "You've been spending much time in the high country lately," the old woman observed casually, stirring corn mush with steady hands. "Gathering season is nearly over. What keeps drawing you to those distant places?" "The spirit of the canyon speaks to me," Kaya replied carefully. It wasn't entirely a lie. She did feel a spiritual connection to the sacred places where she tended the cubs. Naya's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "And what do these canyon spirits tell you?" Before Kaya could respond, commotion erupted from the center of the village. Angry voices carried across the camp, and through the gathering dusk, she could see people running toward the council fire. A mounted figure had arrived, a white man on a lathered horse, his face flushed with anger and exertion. "That's Morrison," Grandmother Naya said grimly, recognizing the rancher despite the poor light. "He only comes here when there's trouble." They joined the crowd gathering around the council fire, where Morrison was speaking in halting, accented Apache to Chief Delgado. His words were supplemented by dramatic gestures and occasional lapses into English when his limited vocabulary failed him. "3 more cattle dead," Uncle Ashki translated for those who couldn't follow Morrison's broken speech. "Killed last night not far from his main corral. He says the tracks lead toward our territory." Chief Delgado, a dignified man whose white hair reflected the firelight like winter snow, listened patiently before responding in careful English. "We hunt the cats too. Our people lose goats, dogs. Wild lions are a problem for Apache and white. Man both." Morrison's face darkened. "Your hunting isn't working fast enough. I've lost 12 head of cattle in 2 months. At this rate, I'll be ruined by winter." "What you want us to do?" Chief Delgado asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I want permission to bring my men onto your land. We'll track these cats down and finish them off permanently. In return, I'll pay your tribe $50 for every lion pelt we collect." A murmur ran through the gathered Apache. $50 was a significant sum, especially with winter approaching and government supplies growing increasingly unreliable. But allowing armed white men onto their territory violated every principle of sovereignty they had left. "We consider." "Your words," Chief Delgado said diplomatically. "Council will meet tomorrow night. Give answer then." Morrison nodded curtly and remounted his horse, but not before his gaze swept across the assembled Apache with undisguised suspicion. "These cats are smart," he said loudly. "Smarter than normal, almost like they're being protected by someone who knows the country." The implication hung in the air like smoke from the council fire. Kaya felt her stomach clench with fear as she realized that her secret might not be as well hidden as she had hoped. After Morrison rode away, the village buzzed with tense discussions. Some argued for accepting the rancher's offer. The money could buy supplies for the coming winter, and mountain lions were natural enemies of their livestock anyway. Others saw it as another step toward complete submission to white authority, the gradual erosion of their right to govern their own lands. "The cats must be found and killed," Uncle Ashki declared, his voice carrying over the other conversations. "Whether we do it ourselves or let Morrison's men do it, the killing must happen. These lions are bringing too much trouble to our people." Kaya slipped away from the crowd, her mind racing with desperate plans. She had to warn the cubs somehow, had to find a way to move them to safety before the hunting parties began their systematic search. But where could two young mountain lions hide in a territory that was about to be combed by experienced trackers? As she walked through the darkness toward her grandmother's wickiup, a brass object caught the firelight near the path. Bending to examine it, she found a military compass, its polished surface engraved with the seal of the U.S. Army. Someone, probably a cavalry scout accompanying Morrison, had dropped it during the evening's visit. Kaya picked up the compass, watching its needle swing toward magnetic north with mechanical precision. Like the white men themselves, it pointed in only one direction. Unable to understand the fluid, circular nature of Apache navigation that relied on landmarks, seasons, and spiritual guidance rather than rigid adherence to arbitrary directions, she slipped the compass into her clothing, thinking it might someday prove useful, but mostly treasuring it as evidence of how lost the white men truly were in this landscape they claimed to own. They needed their metal tools and straight lines because they couldn't read the desert's natural language, couldn't feel the subtle communications that flowed between all living things. But their blindness might also be her salvation. If she could move the cubs to a place the white men's compasses couldn't find, a place known only to those who understood the old ways of navigation, perhaps there was still hope. The hunting would begin at dawn, but Kaya had the advantage of knowing exactly where the most important prey was hidden. The question was whether a grieving Apache girl could outwit trained trackers, angry ranchers, and the growing suspicions of her own people long enough to save the creatures who had become her reason for living. Dawn came gray and cold, with the promise of the season's first frost glittering on the canyon walls. Kaya had barely slept, her mind churning with plans to relocate the cubs before the hunting parties began their systematic search. She slipped out of her grandmother's wickiup before the old woman awakened, carrying a small bundle of dried meat and the hand-carved wooden flute that had once belonged to her father. The flute was one of her most precious possessions, a piece of cottonwood, carved with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and dance in changing light. Her father had made it during the long winter nights, when she was very small, teaching her the traditional melodies that told stories of the hunt, the seasons, and the eternal dance between predator and prey. Since his death, she had rarely played it, but something told her the cubs might respond to its ancient songs. She found Aicha and Itzan alert and restless in their cave, as if they had sensed the change in the morning's energy. Both cubs had grown significantly in the past 2 weeks. Aicha now reached nearly to Kaya's waist when standing on her hind legs, and Itzan's shoulders showed the broadening that would eventually develop into the massive frame of a full-grown male mountain lion. "We have to go deeper into the mountains," Kaya whispered to them, offering small pieces of dried venison as she spoke. "There are men coming with guns and dogs. You're not safe here anymore." Aicha accepted the meat with her usual enthusiasm, but Itzan remained wary, his amber eyes fixed on something beyond the cave entrance. His ears were pricked forward in the alert posture Kaya had learned to recognize as a warning. Someone was approaching. Kaya quickly guided both cubs into the deepest recess of the cave, using hand signals she had developed over the past weeks to communicate the need for absolute silence. Then she positioned herself near the entrance, trying to look as if she had simply stopped to rest during a morning gathering expedition. Zuma appeared at the cave mouth, breathing hard from her climb up the canyon wall. Her face was tight with anxiety, and she carried news that made Kaya's blood run cold. 3 hunting parties left the village before sunrise, Zuma whispered urgently. Uncle Ashki is leading one group toward the northern ridges. Joaquin is searching the eastern canyons, and Morrison's men are working their way up from the south with dogs. Dogs! Kaya felt her stomach clench with fear. She hadn't anticipated. Tracking dogs. Their sensitive noses would make hiding the cubs nearly impossible. 2 bloodhounds and a pack of hunting dogs, Zuma confirmed. They're following the scent trail from Morrison's dead cattle, but if they pick up the cubs' smell... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Once the dogs found the cubs' scent, the hunt would lead directly to this canyon, and no amount of clever hiding would save them. "Help me move them," Kaya said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "There's an old trail that leads to the high springs, too narrow for horses, too steep for dogs. We can hide them there until the search moves on." Zuma looked skeptical. "That's a 4-hour climb through dangerous country. The cubs are too big to carry and too young to make that journey on their own." "Then we'll teach them to follow," Kaya replied with more confidence than she felt. She pulled out her father's flute and played a soft, low melody, the hunting song that mimicked the call of a mountain lion mother to her cubs. The effect was immediate and startling. Both cubs emerged from their hiding place, their ears forward, and eyes bright with recognition. Some ancestral memory, encoded in their wild DNA, responded to the ancient rhythms that had guided their kind for thousands of years. "How did you know they would do that?" Zuma asked in amazement. "I didn't," Kaya admitted, "but my father used to say that music is the oldest language, the one all living things understand." They began the treacherous ascent toward the high country, with Kaya playing soft melodies on the flute to keep the cubs focused and moving forward. The trail was indeed narrow and steep, winding through a landscape of red stone pinnacles and hidden springs that few humans had ever visited. Aicha proved to be a natural climber, her powerful hind legs propelling her up rock faces that seemed impossible to navigate. Itzan was more cautious but equally capable, pausing frequently to test each foothold before committing his weight to the precarious path. They had been climbing for nearly 2 hours when Kaya heard the distant baying of hounds echoing from the canyon below. The search parties had found the cubs' scent trail and were following it toward their former hiding place. Soon they would discover the empty caves and begin expanding their search in all directions. "Faster," Kaya urged, increasing the tempo of her flute playing. The cubs responded immediately, their wild instincts recognizing the urgency in her tone. They crested a narrow ridge just as the sun reached its zenith, revealing a hidden valley that seemed untouched by time or human presence. Natural springs fed a small meadow surrounded by towering cliffs, while ancient juniper trees provided shelter and concealment. It was a perfect sanctuary, remote enough to avoid casual discovery, yet accessible to someone who knew the secret. "Paths!" As they descended into the valley, Itzan suddenly froze, his body going rigid with alarm. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and his sister immediately moved to stand beside him. both cubs staring at something in the tall grass near the springs. Kaya followed their gaze and felt her heart skip with terror. Coiled in a patch of afternoon sunlight was a diamond-back rattlesnake, its distinctive pattern gleaming like polished brass. The serpent was huge, nearly 6 feet long and as thick as Kaya's arm, and its raised head swayed hypnotically as it prepared to strike. The snake had been hunting near the water source and was now trapped between the approaching cubs and the rocky wall behind it. In its agitation, it began to rattle, filling the peaceful valley with the ominous sound of castanets played by death itself. Before Kaya could react, both cubs moved with the fluid coordination of born predators. Apache circled to the left, while its son approached from the right, their movements so synchronized they seemed to share a single mind. The rattlesnake's head swiveled frantically between them, unable to focus on both threats simultaneously, in a burst of speed that was almost too fast to follow. Its son feinted toward the snake's head, while Apache struck from the side, her powerful jaws clamping down just behind the serpent's skull. The rattlesnake writhed violently for a moment, then went limp. "Mother of spirits," Zuma breathed, staring at the cubs with new respect. "They saved your life." Kaya knelt beside the cubs, running her hands through their fur as they purred with satisfaction. For the first time, she truly understood what she was caring for. Not pet cats or tame creatures, but apex predators whose wild intelligence and protective instincts were already fully developed despite their youth. "They're not just animals," she murmured, watching as Itzan carefully inspected the dead snake to ensure it posed no further threat. "They're family." The afternoon light slanted lower as they established a new hiding place among the juniper trees, far from any trail that human hunters might follow. The cubs seemed to approve of their new territory, exploring every corner of the valley with the thorough attention of creatures claiming their domain. As evening approached, the distant sound of baying hounds gradually faded, moving away toward other canyons and false trails. For now, at least, the cubs were safe, but Kaya knew this was only a temporary respite. The hunting parties would eventually expand their search to include even the most remote valleys, and her secret could not remain hidden forever. She played a final melody on her father's flute as darkness gathered, a song of gratitude for the day's successful escape, and a prayer to the mountain spirits for continued protection. In the growing twilight, 2 golden forms settled down beside her, their warm bodies pressed against hers in trust and affection. For the first time since her mother's death, Kaya felt truly at peace. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she was no longer facing them alone. 3 weeks in the high valley had transformed both the cubs and Kaya's understanding of her relationship with them. What had begun as rescue had evolved into something deeper, a bond that seemed to transcend the usual boundaries between human and animal consciousness. Apache had grown sleek and confident, her hunting skills developing with each passing day. She could now catch rabbits with deadly efficiency and had even managed to bring down a young deer, an accomplishment that filled Kaya with pride and worry in equal measure. Each successful hunt meant the cubs were becoming more independent, less dependent on her daily visits. Itzan remained the more cautious of the two, but his protective instincts toward both his sister and Kaya had grown stronger. He had appointed himself guardian of their valley sanctuary, spending long hours perched on high rocks where he could survey approaches from all directions. His amber eyes missed nothing, and his low warning growls had twice alerted them to the presence of human searchers in distant canyons. It was during one of these peaceful afternoon visits that disaster struck. Kaya had brought a special treat, fresh goat meat she had carefully saved from her family's evening meal, and was watching the cubs share their feast when Apache suddenly stopped eating and began making distressed sounds. At first Kaya thought the meat had simply gone down wrong, but as minutes passed, the female cub's distress increased. Foam appeared at the corners of Apache's mouth, and her breathing became labored. She stumbled when she tried to walk, her coordination failing as whatever poison was attacking her system spread through her bloodstream. Bad meat, Kaya whispered in horror, realizing what had happened. The goat had probably eaten some toxic plant, and the poison had concentrated in its flesh. She had unknowingly fed her beloved cub something that might kill her. Itsan paced frantically around his sister, making anxious sounds that tore at Kaya's heart. His distress was so intense that he began to gag in sympathy, though he had eaten none of the tainted meat. Kaya's mind raced through everything her grandmother had taught her about healing, but most of the traditional remedies were designed for humans, not wild animals. Still, the principles might be the same. Force the poison from the system, support the body's natural defenses, and trust in the healing power of the spirit world. She needed help, and she needed it quickly. But seeking assistance meant revealing her secret to someone who might not understand, someone who might insist the cubs be destroyed rather than treated. As Aicha's condition worsened, collapsing onto her side with labored breathing, Kaya made a desperate decision. She scooped the cub into her arms, no easy task now that Aicha weighed nearly 40 pounds, and began the treacherous descent toward the village. Halfway down the mountain, she met Zuma coming up the trail with a worried expression. "I saw you." "Leave with the meat bundle," her friend explained. "Something felt wrong about today." "Aicha is dying," Kaya gasped, her arms aching from carrying the cub's dead weight. "Poisoned meat. I need grandmother's medicine." Without hesitation, Zuma took Itsan, who had refused to be left behind, and helped support Aicha during the descent. The male cub was clearly distraught, making soft, crying sounds as he watched his sister's labored breathing. They reached the village as evening shadows began to gather, slipping through the outskirts to avoid detection. But their luck ran out just as they approached Grandmother Naya's wickiup. Ilan, the young warrior who had begun showing interest in Kaya, was visiting with her grandmother when they arrived. He stared in shock at the two girls, carrying mountain lion cubs, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his belt. But something in Kaya's desperate expression stopped him from drawing the weapon. "Please," Kaya whispered. "She's dying. I just need medicine." Ilan looked from the cubs to Kaya's tear-streaked face, his expression cycling through confusion, alarm, and something that might have been understanding. He was young enough to remember the pain of losing beloved animals, old enough to recognize the depth of genuine grief. "Grandmother," he called softly into the dwelling, "we need your healing skills." Naya emerged, took one look at the situation, and motioned them all inside without a word of surprise or judgment, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. "Lay her here," she instructed, indicating a pile of soft furs near the fire. "Boy," she addressed Ilan, "you will help or you will leave. But if you stay, you speak of this to no one." Ilan nodded solemnly. "I will help." The next hours blurred together in a desperate fight for Aicha's life. Grandmother Naya worked with the calm efficiency of someone who had battled death many times before. She prepared tinctures from her medicine pouch, sacred plants that Kaya recognized but had never seen used in such combinations. "Hold her head steady," Naya instructed, forcing a bitter-smelling liquid down Aicha's throat. "This will make her body reject the poison." Within minutes, Aicha began vomiting violently, expelling the tainted meat along with a dark, foul-smelling fluid that made the entire wickiup reek of sickness. But her breathing became easier, and the glazed look in her eyes began to clear. Itsan never left his sister's side, lying pressed against her body to share his warmth. Occasionally he would lick her face with gentle strokes, making soft sounds of encouragement. His devotion was so complete that it brought tears to Kaya's eyes. "Your cubs have strong spirits," Naya observed as she prepared another healing mixture. "And you have chosen a dangerous path, granddaughter." "You knew?" Kaya asked. "A grandmother knows many things. The question is not what I know, but what you plan to do now." The old woman's eyes fixed on Ilan with pointed intensity. "The secret circle grows larger. Soon it will be too large to remain secret. Ilan shifted uncomfortably, but met Naya's gaze steadily. I will not betray Kaya's trust, but the old woman speaks truth. Others will discover this eventually. By midnight, Aicha had recovered enough to lift her head and take small sips of water. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger problem remained. The cubs were now too big to hide easily, too healthy to remain dependent on Kaya's care, and too dangerous to be discovered by the wrong people. They need to learn to hunt properly, Naya said as dawn approached, to survive in the wild without human help. This sickness was a warning. You cannot protect them from everything. Over. The following days, Ilan proved to be an unexpected ally. His warrior training had included extensive knowledge of animal behavior, and he understood predator psychology in ways that complemented Kaya's intuitive connection with the cubs. Together, they developed a training program designed to prepare Aicha and its son for eventual independence. Ilan taught them to hunt cooperatively, using techniques borrowed from wolfpack behavior. He showed them how to identify dangerous plants and animals, how to find water in the desert, and how to avoid human detection. His respect for the cubs grew as he witnessed their intelligence and adaptability. They learned faster than most warriors, he admitted to Kaya as they watched the cubs successfully stalk and kill a full-grown mule deer. Their minds worked differently from domestic animals, more like human minds, but with wild instincts we have forgotten. The successful hunt marked a turning point. The cubs no longer needed regular feeding from their human family, though they continued to return to the hidden valley each evening to sleep beside Kaya. Their independence was growing, but their emotional bonds remained strong. It was during this period of transition that Kaya first heard the stories the village elders were telling about the ghost lions, mysterious mountain cats that appeared and disappeared like spirits, leaving no tracks that human hunters could follow. The descriptions matched her cubs perfectly, and she realized that Aicha and Itsan were developing reputations as supernatural beings. Perhaps that is for the best, Grandmother Naya suggested when Kaya shared her concerns. Men fear what they cannot understand. If the people believe your cubs are spirits rather than ordinary animals, they may be less likely to hunt them. But fear could be as dangerous as hatred, and Kaya knew that superstition sometimes led to more extreme measures than simple hunting. If the village became convinced that evil spirits in the form of mountain lions were haunting their territory, they might call in medicine men from other tribes, or worse, invite white soldiers to cleanse the area with guns and fire. As summer deepened and the cubs approached their first birthday, Kaya felt the bittersweet approach of an inevitable separation. Aicha and Itsan were becoming true mountain lions, magnificent creatures whose wild nature could no longer be contained by human affection, no matter how deep. The day came when they failed to return to the valley for the first time, staying away for 3 days before reappearing with the satisfied demeanor of cats who had established their own territory somewhere in the high country. Kaya understood the message. They were ready to live as wild creatures, but they had not forgotten their human family. That night, as she played her father's flute under stars that seemed closer than ever before, Kaya felt her mother's turquoise bracelet pulse with warmth against her wrist. The spirits were speaking, telling her that love sometimes meant accepting change rather than resisting it. The cubs had given her something precious, a reason to live beyond grief, a purpose that connected her to the eternal cycle of life, and a death and renewal that governed all wild things. Now it was time to give them something equally precious in return, the freedom to become what they were meant to be. The winds of change came with the season's first hard frost, carrying more than cold air across the desert landscape. Word had reached the Apache village that territorial authorities in Tucson were preparing new legislation that would strip away the last vestiges of tribal sovereignty, forcing all remaining Apache bands onto a single reservation hundreds of miles to the north. Kaya discovered the full scope of the crisis during a village council meeting that her uncle Ashki insisted she attend. "She's old enough to understand what's coming," he told grandmother Naya with grim finality, "and young enough that these decisions will shape her entire life." Chief Delgado stood before the assembled tribe, holding fragments of an official document that the desert wind had torn from a messenger's saddlebag. The papers were water-stained and partially illegible, but their meaning was clear enough. The government's patience with scattered Apache settlements had reached its end. "They give us 60 days, the chief announced, his weathered voice carrying across the silent gathering. 60 days to gather our belongings and report to the agency at San Carlos. Any who refuse will be considered hostile and hunted by the cavalry." A murmur of despair rippled through the crowd. San Carlos was a place of dust and disease, where proud warriors were reduced to begging for government rations, and children forgot the songs of their ancestors. It represented everything the traditional Apache feared most: confinement, dependency, the slow death of cultural identity. "What of our sacred places?" asked Dolores, an elderly woman whose family had tended the ceremonial grounds for generations. "The burial sites of our ancestors, the springs that hold the spirits of our people." Chief Delgado's silence was answer enough. The white government made no provisions for Apache spiritual needs, viewing their connection to specific landscapes as primitive superstition that needed to be overcome through civilization. Kaya felt her stomach clench with fear that had nothing to do with her own fate. If the tribe was forced to relocate, what would happen to Aicha and Itzan? The cubs had established their territory in these specific mountains, following ancient migration patterns that were encoded in their instincts. They couldn't simply be moved to a different landscape like human prisoners. After the council disbanded in sullen defeat, Kaya sought out her grandmother for guidance. She found Naya sitting alone beside the dying council fire, staring into the embers with the expression of someone reading messages in the flames. "Grandmother, what will happen to the cubs when we leave?" Naya looked up with eyes that held depths of sorrow Kaya was only beginning to understand. "Perhaps they will be safer without us, child. Wild creatures adapt to change better than civilized." "People do," but Kaya wasn't convinced. She had watched the cubs for over a year now, studying their behavior and gradually understanding the complex social structures that governed mountain lion society. Aicha and Itzan were still young adults, not yet fully established in their territory. Without the security of their hidden valley and the protection of their human family's vigilance, they might be driven out by older, more experienced cats. The next morning brought news that made everything worse. Morrison arrived at the village with a cavalry escort, his face flushed with anger and his voice raised in accusation. "Those ghost lions killed another of my prize bulls last night," he announced, to anyone within earshot. "And this time I found tracks leading directly toward your camping areas." Lieutenant Crawford, a young officer whose crisp uniform looked absurdly out of place in the desert setting, studied the assembled Apache with the suspicious gaze of someone who had been taught to see all Indians as potential threats. "Mr. Morrison has filed formal complaints with the territorial governor," Crawford announced. "If these lion attacks continue, we'll be forced to conduct a systematic extermination program throughout this entire region." Kaya felt her blood turn to ice. A military extermination program would mean professional hunters, tracking dogs, and enough firepower to kill every large predator in the territory. Even if the cubs weren't responsible for the cattle attacks, and she was certain they weren't, they would be caught up in the slaughter simply for being mountain lions. That afternoon, she slipped away from the village to check on Aicha and Itzan in their valley sanctuary. She found them basking in the autumn sunshine, their golden fur gleaming with health and vitality. Both cubs had grown into magnificent specimens, Aicha sleek and graceful, Itzan broad-shouldered and powerful. They greeted her arrival with the purring sounds that never failed to warm her heart, rubbing against her legs like oversized house cats. But as she watched them play, Kaya noticed something that filled her with new dread. Scattered around their resting area were the remains of recent kills: rabbits, a young deer, and what looked like the hide of a domestic goat. The cubs were hunting successfully, but they were also taking easier prey when the opportunity arose. It was only a matter of time before their hunting range expanded to include the white settlers' livestock. Young mountain lions were opportunistic feeders, and cattle represented large, slow-moving targets that could feed them for days. Once they made the connection between human settlements and easy meals, no amount of training or affection would prevent them from following their predatory instincts. "You're going to get yourselves killed," Kaya whispered, stroking Itzan's massive head as he purred against her shoulder. "And there's nothing I can do to stop it," as if he understood her. "Words!" Itzan pulled back and fixed her with those amber eyes that seemed to hold depths of wild intelligence. For a moment, she felt as if he was trying to communicate something important, some understanding that transcended the barrier between human and animal consciousness. That evening, Kaya shared her fears with Ilan as they walked along the canyon rim where they had first met as conspirators in the cubs' care. The young warrior listened thoughtfully, his expression growing more troubled as she described the evidence of the cubs' expanding hunting territory. "There may be a solution," he said finally, "but it would require great courage from you and great sacrifice. Tell me, my grandfather once spoke of a place in the far mountains, beyond the white settlements, where the old people used to take sacred animals when they needed to be returned to the spirit world, a place called the Canyon of the Cat People, where mountain lions were honored as guardians of the ancient ways." Kaya had heard whispers of such places, remote sanctuaries where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin, where animals and humans could communicate directly with the forces that governed all life. But she had always assumed they were legends, stories told to children to keep alive the memory of times when the relationship between people and wild creatures was more balanced. "You think such a place really exists?" "I think we have to believe it exists," Elan replied, "because the alternative is watching your cubs die in a hail of settler bullets." As they stood together in the gathering darkness, watching stars emerge. In the desert sky, Kaya felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. The white world was closing in on all of them, human and animal alike, and the old ways of living in harmony with wild things were being swept away by the tide of what men called civilization. But perhaps there was still time for one last act of defiance, one final gesture toward the ancient agreements that had once governed the relationship between Apache people and the spirits of the wild places. If the Canyon of the Cat People was real, if it could provide sanctuary for creatures too wild to survive in a domesticated world, then the journey would be worth any risk. The question was whether her heart could bear the cost of loving something enough to set it free forever. The hunting parties converged on the hidden valley, like storm clouds gathering before a thunderstorm. Uncle Ashki led the Apache trackers, his face set with the grim determination of a man who had finally run out of patience with his niece's mysterious behavior. Morrison's men approached from the south with their pack of bloodhounds, while a cavalry patrol swept down from the northern ridges, their rifles glinting in the morning sunlight. Kaya watched their approach from a concealed position high above the valley floor, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized how perfectly they had her trapped. Someone, she suspected Morrison, had finally put together enough pieces of evidence to triangulate the cubs' location. The scattered livestock kills, the reports of ghost lions that appeared and disappeared without leaving traceable tracks. The subtle signs that someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain was protecting the predators. Aicha and Itzan seemed to sense the approaching danger. Both cubs paced restlessly near the valley's spring, their ears pricked forward, and their powerful bodies coiled with nervous energy. They looked toward Kaya's hiding place repeatedly, as if seeking guidance from the human who had shaped so much of their young lives. Below, the hunting parties reached the valley entrance and began their careful advance. The bloodhounds immediately picked up the cubs' scent, their excited baying echoing off the canyon walls like the voices of demons. Morrison himself carried a heavy rifle, its polished stock decorated with brass fittings that reflected the harsh desert sun. "Tracks everywhere," Uncle Ashki called out, kneeling to examine the soft earth near the spring. "Multiple animals, but the same two sets appearing over and over. They've been living here for months." Lieutenant Crawford studied the evidence with professional interest. "Explains why we could never track them to a permanent den. They had human help in selecting this location." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Everyone present understood that mountain lions didn't choose hiding places with such tactical advantages unless they had been guided by human intelligence. Someone in the Apache camp had been protecting these predators, and that someone would face serious consequences once their identity was discovered. Kaya felt the silver locket she had found weeks earlier, a memento dropped by one of the settler children, press against her chest like a cold weight. The locket contained a photograph of a young white girl with blonde hair and serious eyes, a reminder that the conflict between her people and the settlers involved real families with real losses on both sides. But as she watched the hunting party prepare their weapons, Kaya's sympathy for the settlers' losses was overwhelmed by desperate love for the creatures who had given her life meaning after her mother's death. She couldn't simply hide and watch while Aicha and Itsan were gunned down like common vermin. Making a decision that would change everything, Kaya stood up from her concealment and called out to the hunters below. "Wait! They're not the ones killing your cattle." Every head turned toward her voice, and she saw Uncle Ashki's face flush with a mixture of anger, shame, and something that might have been relief. He had suspected her involvement for weeks, and now his worst fears were confirmed. "Kaya, come down here immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief addressing a subordinate warrior. She began the treacherous descent toward the valley floor, her mind racing through explanations that might save the cubs' lives. Behind her, she could hear Aicha and Itsan following at a distance, their natural caution warring with their protective instincts toward their human family member. "Those cats are full-grown predators," Morrison shouted as Kaya approached the group. "If you've been feeding them, protecting them, you're responsible for every head of livestock they've killed." "They haven't killed your cattle," Kaya replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "They hunt deer and rabbits in the high country. I've watched them for over a year. They avoid human settlements." Lieutenant Crawford studied her with the calculating gaze of someone trained to detect deception. "Then who's been killing Morrison's stock?" Before Kaya could answer, a new sound echoed through the valley, the deep, resonant roar of a fully mature mountain lion, but one much larger and more aggressive than either of her cubs. The bloodhounds immediately fell silent, their tails tucked between their legs as they recognized the voice of an apex predator that viewed them as potential prey rather than fellow hunters. From the canyon's eastern wall, a massive male mountain lion emerged with the fluid grace of flowing water. He was easily twice the size of Itsan, with battle scars across his face and shoulders that spoke of years of territorial fights with other predators. This was the true cattle killer, an old, experienced cat who had learned to view domestic livestock as easy hunting. The big male surveyed the humans below with yellow eyes that held no trace of the intelligent curiosity Kaya had grown accustomed to in her cubs. This was pure wild predator, beautiful, deadly, and completely outside the realm of human influence or understanding. "Jesus," Morrison whispered, raising his rifle with hands that trembled slightly. "That's the biggest cat I've ever seen." Uncle Ashki notched an arrow to his bowstring, but his attention was divided between the massive predator and Kaya's cubs, who had now moved into full view near the valley's spring. "Two different sets of animals," he observed grimly. "The young ones and this old killer, The confrontation might have ended in bloodshed for all the cats, but Acha and Itsan chose that moment to demonstrate the intelligence that had always set them apart from ordinary wild animals. Instead of fleeing or cowering, they positioned themselves between the humans and the larger male, making soft vocalizations that seemed to communicate across species boundaries. The big male paused, his attention shifting from the humans to the two young cats, who were clearly claiming some kind of relationship with the strange bipedal creatures below. For several heartbeats, the three mountain lions engaged in a complex exchange of sounds and postures that resembled nothing so much as a diplomatic negotiation. Finally, with a dismissive flick of his tail, the large male turned and bounded up the canyon wall with effortless power, disappearing into the maze of rocks and shadows that had hidden him so effectively from human hunters. "He's the one," Uncle Ashki said quietly, lowering his bow. "The old male. He's been using the young one's territory as a hunting base, knowing that human trackers would focus on them instead of him." Morrison kept his rifle trained on the spot where the big cat had vanished, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Smart," he admitted grudgingly. "Use the tame cats as decoys while the real killer operates from their territory." "They're not tame," Kaya said firmly, but even as she spoke, Aicha approached the group of humans with the confident stride of an animal that had never learned to fear bipedal creatures. The female cub rubbed against Kaya's legs with obvious affection, purring loud enough for everyone to hear. The demonstration of trust and affection between girl and mountain lion was so complete that it silenced even Morrison's objections. This wasn't a case of wild animals being corrupted by human contact. It was something far more rare and precious, a genuine bond between species that transcended the usual predator-prey relationships. "What do we do with them now, Lieutenant?" Crawford asked, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he watched Itsan approach close enough for Kaya to scratch behind his ears. Uncle Ashki looked at his niece with an expression that mixed disappointment with reluctant pride. She had violated every rule their people had about maintaining appropriate distance from wild creatures, but she had also accomplished something that bordered on miraculous. She had created a bridge between the human world and the realm of wild spirits. "We face the consequences of our choices," he said finally, "all of us." The discovery that changed everything came not from the confrontation in the valley, but from what Uncle Ashki found while tracking the escaped male lion deeper into the canyon system. Following the big cat's trail through narrow passages that seemed to twist back upon themselves, he stumbled into a hidden chamber that had been sealed by rockfall for generations. The cave was larger than any natural formation he had ever seen, its walls covered with petroglyphs that seemed to move and shift in the dancing light of his torch. But these weren't ordinary Apache rock paintings. They depicted scenes that challenged everything Ashki thought he knew about his people's relationship with the wild creatures of the desert. Carved into the stone with intricate detail were images of Apache women living alongside mountain lions, not as hunters and prey, but as partners in some ancient covenant. The cats in these paintings wore collars of woven sinew and turquoise, while the women carried staffs topped with lion skulls and bore tattoos that matched the distinctive markings on their feline companions. "Mother of spirits," Ashki whispered, running his fingers over carvings that were clearly hundreds of years old. The cat people, they were real. He had heard the legends, of course, stories passed down through generations about a time when certain Apache bloodlines could communicate directly with mountain spirits through their feline guardians. But he had always assumed they were metaphorical tales, teaching stories designed to illustrate the harmony that should exist between humans and the natural world. Now, faced with undeniable evidence of his ancestors' actual practices, Ashki began to understand why his niece had been drawn so powerfully to the orphaned cubs. This wasn't random compassion or childish rebellion. It was the awakening of ancestral gifts that had been dormant in their bloodline for generations. He gathered several of the smaller carved stones as evidence and hurried back toward the village, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had discovered. If Kaya truly carried the blood of the cat people, then her bond with Aicha and Itsan wasn't an aberration to be corrected. It was a spiritual calling to be honored. But first, he needed to consult with the oldest member of their band, Grandmother Naya, whose knowledge of the ancient ways ran deeper than anyone else's. He found the old woman sitting in the shadow of her wickiup, grinding corn with the methodical patience of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. Her dark eyes fixed on his face as he approached, reading his expression with the insight of someone who had spent decades interpreting the unspoken communications of her people. "You found something in the deep caves," she said without preamble. "Something that explains why Kaya hears the mountain spirits so clearly." Ashki placed the carved stones before her, watching as her weathered fingers traced the ancient symbols with obvious familiarity. "You knew about this? You knew what she was becoming?" "I suspected," Naya admitted. "When she was very small, before her mother died, I saw signs. The way wild animals approached her without fear, the dreams she described, the healing touch she showed with injured creatures. But I hoped the gift would remain dormant. The world has become too dangerous for the old ways." She lifted one of the stones, a piece of black basalt, carved with the image of a woman and mountain lion sharing the same spirit aura. "Your great-great-grandmother carried this gift, Ashki. She could speak with the big cats, understand their needs, even ride them like horses when the spirits moved through her." "What happened to her?" "The same thing that happens to all bridge builders," Naya replied sadly. "The world changed faster than people could adapt. The white men came with their guns and their fear of anything they couldn't control. The cat people were hunted down as witches and devil worshippers. Your ancestor hid her gifts and married a man who promised to protect her secret." Ashki studied the petroglyphs more carefully, beginning to recognize symbols that had appeared. In his own childhood dreams, the bloodline continued, sleeping mostly, waiting for the right time and the right circumstances to awaken again. Naya's gaze shifted toward the distant mountains where Kaya was still tending her cubs. "Your niece represents something precious, a living connection to the sacred agreements our people once made with the spirit world. But she also represents terrible danger." Before Ashki could ask what kind of danger, Elan appeared at the edge of their camp circle, his face bright with excitement and discovery. "Uncle, grandmother, you need to see what we found in the deepest part of the canyon. There are more caves, older ones, and the paintings. We know about the caves," Ashki interrupted gently, "and we know what they mean." Elan's enthusiasm dampened slightly, but his eyes remained bright with wonder. "Then you understand why Kaya can do what she does? Why the cubs respond to her like pack members rather than prey animals?" "I understand that she carries gifts that could get her killed," Naya replied gravely. "If word of this reaches the territorial authorities, they'll brand her a witch and use her abilities as justification for harsher measures against all Apache. And if the traditional leaders of other bands learn about it, they may decide she's bringing dangerous attention to our people." The old woman rose stiffly and began gathering herbs from her medicine bundles, her movements quick and purposeful. "There's something else you need to know, something the petroglyphs don't show clearly. The cat people weren't just companions to mountain lions. They were guardians of sacred places, keepers of ancient knowledge that the spirits entrusted to humans and cats working together." She handed Ashki a leather pouch containing what looked like ordinary pebbles, but which felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own internal light. "These are spirit stones, passed down through the generations of cat people. They mark the locations of the most sacred sites, places where the boundary between worlds grows thin." "What does this have to do with Kaya?" "Everything," Naya replied. The cubs didn't wander into her path by accident. They were drawn by the same spiritual forces that guided her to them. Together, They're meant to protect something, a place or an object or a piece of knowledge that the ancestors considered vital to the survival of our people. As if summoned by their conversation, Kaya appeared at the camp's edge with Aicha and Itzan flanking her like golden shadows. All three seemed to be moving with the synchronized grace of creatures sharing a single consciousness, and the cub's amber eyes held an alertness that spoke of intelligence far beyond normal animal awareness. "The deep caves are calling to them," Kaya announced, without preamble, as if continuing a conversation they had been having in her mind. "Something there needs to be protected, or awakened, or remembered. The spirits won't let me rest until I understand what it is." Ashki exchanged glances with Grandmother Naya, recognizing the tone of voice that marked a true spiritual vision. His niece wasn't speaking from curiosity or stubborn willfulness. She was reporting a direct communication from the ancestor spirits who guided their people through times of crisis. "Then we go to the deep caves," he decided, surprising himself. "With the words, all of us. If the cat people are awakening in our bloodline after all these years, there must be a reason. Something is coming that will require their ancient knowledge." As they prepared for the journey into the sacred depths of the canyon system, none of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above. Lieutenant Crawford, using military field glasses to observe Apache movements as part of his intelligence-gathering mission. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see clearly enough to report that the Apache girl was traveling with 2 full-grown mountain lions that showed no fear of humans. Such a report would confirm every settler's suspicion about Apache, witchcraft and their alleged ability to control wild animals for warfare purposes. The political implications would be enormous, providing justification for the harshest possible measures against all remaining Apache bands. The awakening of the cat people had begun, but it was happening at the worst possible moment in history, a time when such gifts would be seen not as sacred abilities, but as evidence of savage practices that needed to be eliminated through force. The journey to the sacred canyon required 3 days of careful travel through territory that was increasingly patrolled by cavalry units searching for hostile Apache who had failed to report to the reservation. Kaya wore her mother's eagle feather headdress, a ceremonial piece that had been passed down through 5 generations of women in her family, understanding that this might be her last opportunity to honor the ancestors who had worn it before. The headdress felt heavier than she remembered, its weight seeming to increase with each mile they traveled deeper into the ancestral heartland. Each feather represented a vision quest, a moment of spiritual communion with the eagle spirits, who carried messages between the earthly and celestial realms. Now she was embarking on her own vision quest, one that would determine not just her fate, but the future of the ancient covenant between her people and the mountain lions. Aicha and Itzan had grown increasingly alert as they approached the sacred sites, their behavior suggesting they could sense spiritual energies that remained invisible to human perception. They moved with the purposeful stride of creatures following an ancient migration route encoded in their genetic memory, pausing frequently at specific rock formations and water sources that seemed to hold special significance. "They know this place," Alan observed as he watched the cubs investigate a spring that bubbled up from deep underground. "Not just the geography, but the spiritual landscape. They're responding to things we can't see." Grandmother Naya nodded thoughtfully. "The old songs speak of cats who could walk between worlds, following paths that existed in both physical and spirit realms simultaneously. Perhaps these cubs carry that ancestral knowledge." On the second night, camped in a hidden valley that showed no signs of recent human presence, they encountered the first direct evidence that their journey was being observed by unfriendly forces. Itzan returned from a scouting expedition with news that made everyone's blood run cold. He led them to a vantage point where they could see the glow of multiple campfires in the valley below. Cavalry patrol. Uncle Ashki identified grimly. studying the organized layout of the enemy camp through a spyglass borrowed from a trading post years earlier. Full company strength, at least 60 men. They're not just passing through, they're conducting a systematic search. Searching for what? Kaya asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Us, Elin replied bluntly. Lieutenant Crawford filed a report about Apache witches who control wild animals for hostile purposes. The territorial government has authorized a special expedition to capture or eliminate the threat. The irony was bitter. The very gifts that were meant to protect her people were being used as justification for their destruction. The awakening of the cat people bloodline had come at exactly the wrong moment in history, when such abilities would be viewed through the lens of military paranoia rather than spiritual reverence. We could turn back, Uncle Ashki suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't believe retreat was a viable option. Find another route to San Carlos. Try to blend in with the other relocated bands. No, Kaya replied with quiet certainty. The spirits didn't guide us this far just to have us abandon the quest when it becomes dangerous. Whatever the ancestors hid in the deep caves, it's meant to help our people survive what's coming. The third day brought them to the entrance of the Canyon of the Cat People, a narrow defile between towering red cliffs that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Ancient symbols were carved into the rock faces at regular intervals, creating a pathway that was part physical trail and part spiritual journey. The cubs moved along this route with increasing excitement, their amber eyes bright with recognition of something that called to the deepest levels of their wild consciousness. As they descended into the canyon's heart, the petroglyphs became more complex and detailed, telling the story of the original covenant between Apache women and mountain lions. Kaya found herself able to read the symbols with surprising ease, as if the knowledge had been sleeping in her blood for generations and was now awakening in response to proximity to its source. "Here," she said, stopping before a massive stone wall covered with the most intricate carvings they had yet encountered. This is where it happened, the first joining between human and cat spirits. The story told in stone was more beautiful and complex than any legend passed down through oral tradition. It spoke of a time when the boundary between species was fluid, when consciousness could flow between human and animal forms, when the spirits of place chose specific bloodlines to serve as guardians of sacred knowledge. But it also revealed the terrible price of such gifts. The cat people had been hunted not just by white settlers, but by other Apache who feared their power and saw them as a threat to traditional ways. The last true catwoman had died defending this very canyon, her mountain lion companions choosing to die beside her rather than accept captivity or exile. "She was our ancestor," Grandmother Naya whispered, touching a carving that showed a woman whose facial features were unmistakably similar to Kaya's, the last true guardian of the old covenant. She hid something here before she died, something she believed would be needed when the cat people returned. They found the hidden entrance exactly where the petroglyphs indicated it would be, behind a waterfall that required them to wade through chest-deep pools of ice-cold mountain water. The cubs showed no hesitation about the water, swimming with the natural grace of creatures equally at home in any environment. The cave beyond the waterfall was vast and dry, its walls lined with alcoves that contained artifacts from the golden age of human-cat cooperation. There were collars of braided sinew and turquoise, carved wooden flutes designed to mimic mountain lion vocalizations, and ceremonial masks that bore the stylized features of both human and feline faces. But the most remarkable discovery lay at the chamber's heart, a natural crystal formation that had been carefully shaped and polished to focus sunlight into a concentrated beam. The sacred fire crystal was larger than any of them had imagined, easily the size of a human head, and it pulsed with captured light that seemed to have been waiting centuries for the right moment of release. "This is what the spirits wanted us to find," Kaya breathed, approaching the crystal with the reverence due to something that bridged the gap between physical and spiritual realms. The heart of the cat people's power. As she drew closer to the crystal, both cubs began to make sounds she had never heard before, a complex harmony of purring, chirping, and low-frequency rumbles that seemed to resonate with the stone itself. The crystal responded by brightening, its stored sunlight beginning to pulse in rhythm with the cubs' vocalizations. "They're awakening it," Elon observed in amazement. "The crystal has been dormant, waiting for the right combination of human consciousness and cat spirit to activate it." But their moment of wonder was shattered by the sound of voices echoing from the canyon entrance. Harsh commands in English, the jingle of cavalry equipment, and the excited baying of tracking dogs. The military patrol had found their trail and was following it into the sacred canyon. "How long do we have?" Uncle Ashki asked, checking his weapons with the practiced efficiency of a man who had fought too many battles against superior numbers. "Minutes, not hours," Elan replied after a quick reconnaissance toward the cave entrance. "They're bringing dogs and torches. Once they pick up our scent in the water, they'll find this place quickly." Grandmother Naya was already moving toward the crystal, her weathered hands working with surprising speed to prepare something from her medicine bundle. "The final ceremony," she announced, "the one the petroglyphs describe for returning the cat people's gifts to the spirit world." "What does that mean?" Kaya asked, though part of her already understood. "It means choosing between keeping the cubs in a world that will destroy them, or setting them free to join the eternal hunt in the realm of spirits," Naya replied gently. "The crystal can open the doorway, but the choice must be made by someone who carries the bloodline." The approaching voices grew louder, and Kaya could hear Lieutenant Crawford barking orders about surrounding the canyon and preventing any escape. There was no time for lengthy deliberation, no opportunity to explore alternatives that might preserve both the cubs' lives and her connection to them. Aicha and Itsan seemed to understand what was being asked of them. Both cats approached the crystal formation with the solemnity of creatures accepting their destiny, their amber eyes reflecting the pulsing light with an intelligence that transcended ordinary animal consciousness. "They're ready," Kaya whispered, tears streaming down her face as she realized what she was about to lose. "They understand better than I do." The sound of boots splashing through the waterfall pools told them their time had run out. In moments, the sacred cave would be violated by men whose only understanding of power came from the barrels of their guns. Kaya placed her hands on the fire crystal, feeling its warmth flow through her palms and up her arms like liquid sunlight. The cubs moved to flank her, their bodies pressed against her legs in a final gesture of trust and affection. Around them, the ancient cave began to fill with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the boundary between physical and spiritual realms was becoming as thin as morning mist. The last ceremony of the cat people was about to begin, and with it, the most heartbreaking act of love Kaya could imagine, the courage to let go of what she cherished most in order to save it from a world that had no place for such wild grace. The ancient cat collar lay in Kaya's trembling hands, like a bridge between worlds. Braided sinew and turquoise beads that had once adorned the neck of a mountain lion who walked as partner to her great-great-grandmother. The artifact pulsed, with warmth that seemed to echo her own heartbeat, and as she held it up to the crystal's light, symbols became visible along its length that hadn't been apparent before. "The bonding collar," Grandmother Naya breathed, recognizing the sacred object from the oldest stories. "It creates a permanent link between human and cat consciousness, allowing them to share thoughts, emotions, even memories across the boundary. Between life and death." Lieutenant Crawford's voice echoed from the waterfall chamber, closer now and filled with the confidence of a man who believed he had trapped his quarry. "Spread out! Check every alcove! These Apache witches have nowhere left to run." Kaya fastened the collar around Aicha's neck with fingers that shook with emotion and urgency. The female cub accepted the ancient artifact with the solemnity of a creature understanding the magnitude of the moment, her amber eyes reflecting depths of intelligence that seemed almost human. The moment the collar settled into place, Kaya gasped as her consciousness suddenly expanded to encompass sensations beyond normal human experience. She could smell the approaching soldiers with predatory clarity, could hear their heartbeats, and taste their fear sweat on the air. More remarkably, she could feel Aicha's emotions as clearly as her own: love, trust, and a wild joy at finally understanding her true nature. "The connection is complete," she whispered, reaching out to touch Itzan's massive head. "I can feel what they feel, know what they know." Through the cub's enhanced senses, she perceived things that human awareness could never detect, the subtle energy flows that marked this cave as a nexus point between dimensions. The presence of spirit cats who had been waiting centuries for this moment, and most importantly, the existence of a hidden passage that led deeper into the mountain's heart. "There's another way out," she announced, pointing toward what appeared to be solid rock, but which the cub's eyes revealed as a cleverly concealed opening. The ancestors wouldn't have built a sacred chamber with only one entrance. Uncle Ashki moved to examine the wall, running his hands over stone that felt warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate with subtle energy. "Here," he said, finding the hidden mechanism that caused a section of the wall to swing inward on perfectly balanced hinges. They built it to be opened from the inside, probably as protection against enemies who might try to desecrate the sacred space. The passage beyond was narrow but navigable, sloping upward through natural rock formations toward what might be another exit. More importantly, it would take them away from the military patrol and give them time to complete the ceremony that would determine the cub's ultimate fate. As they prepared to enter the hidden tunnel, the crystal formation suddenly blazed with light so intense it painted every surface of the cave in brilliant white radiance. The illumination lasted only seconds, but in that brief flare, Kaya saw something that made her heart skip with wonder and terror. Standing in the alcoves around the cave's perimeter were the spirits of the ancient cat people, translucent figures of Apache women accompanied by the ghostly forms of their mountain lion partners. They watched the unfolding drama with expressions of approval and encouragement, as if this moment represented the fulfillment of prophecies they had been waiting generations to witness. "The ancestors are here," she whispered to her companions, though she suspected they could all sense the spiritual presence that filled the chamber like invisible smoke. "They're waiting to guide Aicha and Itzan to whatever comes next." The sound of military boots on stone warned them that their hiding time was nearly over. Through the waterfall entrance came the first of Crawford's soldiers, their torches held high and their rifles ready for action. They moved with the careful coordination of men who had been told they were hunting dangerous witches capable of controlling wild animals. "Empty," called the first soldier to emerge fully into the chamber. "But there are fresh tracks everywhere. They were definitely here." "Keep searching," Crawford's voice commanded from the entrance. "There have to be other passages. These caves could extend for miles underground." Kaya pressed herself against the hidden door, feeling it swing closed behind them, just as the soldiers began their systematic exploration of the cave. Through her connection with Aicha, she could sense the men's mounting frustration as they found evidence of recent habitation, but no trace of their quarry. More importantly, she could feel something else through the cub's supernatural awareness, the presence of the massive male mountain lion who had been the real cattle killer. He was somewhere in the cave system, drawn by the same spiritual energies that had guided them to this place, and his intentions were far from peaceful. The old male had come to challenge Itzan for dominance of the territory, and the confined space of the sacred caves would make their inevitable confrontation even more dangerous. The ceremony to release the cubs to the spirit world might have to wait until they survived a battle that would test everything she had learned about the bond between human consciousness and wild feline instincts. The final confrontation came not with the soldiers, but with the massive male mountain lion, who emerged from the deepest shadows of the tunnel system like a golden ghost made flesh. His yellow eyes held no trace of the intelligence and affection that characterized Aicha and Itzan. This was pure predator, ancient and territorial, driven by instincts that recognized no law except survival of the strongest. Itzan immediately moved to place himself between the intruder and his human family, his body language shifting into the aggressive posture of a male defending his territory. At nearly 2 years old, he was approaching his full size and strength, but the challenger outweighed him by at least 50 pounds and bore the battle scars of a cat who had been winning territorial disputes for years. Through the sacred collars, connection. Kaya felt Aicha's complex response to the situation. She recognized the large male as the one who had been using their territory for hunting, but she also sensed something else about him that made her approach with cautious curiosity, rather than immediate hostility. He's not just a rogue cat, Kaya realized aloud, her enhanced perception allowing her to read the spiritual emanations that surrounded the massive feline. He carries the bloodline too. He's a descendant of the sacred cats, just like Aicha and Itzan. Grandmother Naya studied the newcomer with eyes that held decades of experience reading animal behavior. That explains his intelligence and his timing. He was drawn here by the same spiritual forces that called to your cubs. The large male moved with fluid grace toward the crystal formation, ignoring the humans completely as if they were beneath. His notice. When he reached the sacred fire crystal, he did something that stunned everyone present. He began to vocalize in the same complex harmonies that Aicha and Itzan had used to activate the stone. The crystal responded immediately, its stored light flaring to life with an intensity that filled the entire tunnel system with pulsing radiance. But this time, the illumination revealed more than just the physical structure of the caves. It opened windows into the spirit realm itself, showing glimpses of the eternal hunting grounds where the souls of departed cat people and their feline partners continued their ancient partnership. The final ceremony, Grandmother Naya whispered in recognition. He knows how to complete it. He's the missing piece. The guardian male who was meant to guide Aicha and Itzan into their spiritual transformation. Through her enhanced connection with the cubs, Kaya suddenly understood the true nature of what was happening. This wasn't a territorial challenge or a battle for dominance. It was a spiritual calling, the final gathering of the bloodline before their transition to a higher plane of existence. The 3 mountain lions formed a triangle around the crystal formation, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the mountain itself. The sacred fire crystal responded by projecting beams of concentrated light that touched each cat in turn, creating a pattern of illumination that matched exactly the petroglyphs they had seen in the outer caves. They're opening the doorway. Ilan breathed in amazement, watching as the crystal's light began to bend and shift in ways that defied normal physics. The passage between worlds. Kaya felt her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously as she realized what she was witnessing. The cubs she had raised and loved were about to transcend their physical forms, joining the eternal pack of spirit cats who had been waiting centuries for their bloodline to return to full power. But the ceremony required one final element, the willing sacrifice of the human who had served as their bridge between worlds. The cat people couldn't complete their transformation without their human partner accepting the same spiritual transition. No, Uncle Ashki said firmly, reading the acceptance in Kaya's eyes. You're too young. You have too much life ahead of you. This is what I was born for, Kaya replied with quiet certainty. Everything that's happened, finding the cubs, learning to communicate with them, discovering the ancient caves, It was all leading to this moment. She approached the crystal formation, feeling the warm light wash over her skin like liquid sunlight. Through the sacred collar, she could sense Aisha and Itzan's emotional response to her decision, love, gratitude, and a deep understanding that transcended the barrier between species. The large male fixed her with those ancient yellow eyes, and for the first time she saw recognition rather than indifference in his gaze. He was acknowledging her as the true heir to the cat people tradition, the human consciousness capable of bridging the gap between mortal existence and eternal spiritual partnership. As the crystal's light intensified toward the moment of transformation, Kaya heard the sound of approaching voices, not the harsh commands of soldiers, but the gentle tones of Apache voices calling her name. Help was coming, but it might arrive too late to change anything. The doorway between worlds was opening, and the choice was hers. Step through into eternal partnership with the spirits of the wild places, or find a way to honor the ancient covenant. While remaining in the world of the living, the sacred fire crystal pulsed with the rhythm of her heartbeat, waiting for her final decision. 50 years later, in a small house on the Mescalero Apache reservation, an elderly woman sat beside her granddaughter, carefully threading beads onto sinew, as she had done countless times throughout her long life. Her weathered hands moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades creating beautiful things, but her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond the ordinary scope of human existence. "Tell me the story again, Grandmother Kaya," requested 8-year-old Naya, her dark eyes bright with the curiosity that reminded her grandmother so powerfully of another child who had once asked similar questions in a very different world. Kaya smiled, setting aside the memory blanket she had been working on, a magnificent piece of weaving that told the story of her youth in symbols and patterns that few people could still interpret. Each section represented a different phase of her journey with Aicha and Itzan, from their first meeting as orphaned cubs to the final ceremony in the sacred caves. "Which part would you like to hear?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The part about the choice," Naya replied immediately. "The part where you had to decide whether to go with the cats into the spirit world or stay here with us." Kaya nodded, her gaze drifting toward the window where the desert stretched endlessly toward mountains that held secrets older than human memory. "That was the hardest decision I ever made, little one. The crystal was calling to me. The cats were ready to make the journey, and part of me wanted nothing more than to follow them into that eternal hunting ground where pain and loss don't exist." She had stood at the threshold between worlds, feeling the pull of spiritual transformation when the voices of her human family had reached her through the crystal caves. Not just Uncle Ashki and the others, but the entire tribe, men, women, and children, who had tracked them through the desert because they understood finally that Kaya's gifts represented hope rather than threat. But then I realized that the cat people weren't meant to abandon the physical world entirely, she continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller who had perfected this tale through decades of telling. They were meant to serve as bridges, helping both humans and cats find their way through the changing times ahead. The crystal had shown her a vision of the future, generations of her descendants who would carry the bloodline forward, protecting sacred places and maintaining the ancient agreements between human consciousness and wild spirit. The cats needed human partners to survive in a world increasingly dominated by those who saw nature only as something to be conquered and controlled. "So you chose to stay?" Naya prompted, having heard this part many times, but never tiring of it. "I chose to serve," Kaya corrected gently. "The cats made their own choice, to return to the spirit realm but remain connected to our world through the bloodline we shared. Aicha and Itzan became guardians of the sacred canyon, protecting it from those who would disturb its peace, while I became the keeper of their memory and the teacher of those who would carry the gifts forward." The ceremony. had ended not with death and transcendence, but with transformation and commitment. The cubs had faded into light and energy, becoming part of the eternal consciousness that governed all wild places, while Kaya had accepted the responsibility of preserving their story and preparing future generations for their own encounters. With the sacred, and their children still live in the mountains, Naya asked, though she knew this part of the story as well. They're spiritual children, Kaya confirmed. Every few generations, cubs are born who carry the old bloodline. Cats who are too intelligent for their own good, who seem to understand human speech and respond to the ancient songs. When that happens, someone from our family must be ready to guide them, to help them find their path between the world of flesh and the realm of spirit. She reached into a wooden box beside her chair and withdrew the sacred collar, still intact after all these years, its turquoise beads catching the afternoon light like captured pieces of sky. This will be yours someday, when you're old enough to understand its full meaning. Naya's eyes widened with wonder and trepidation. Will I have to choose like you did? Everyone makes their own choice, Kaya replied wisely. But the bloodline continues, and the covenant remains strong. The spirits of the wild places still need human partners who understand that love sometimes means letting go, and that the greatest strength comes not from controlling nature, but from learning to communicate with it. That evening, as sunset painted the desert in shades of copper and gold, a large mountain lion appeared on the ridge behind Kaya's house. The cat sat motionless for several minutes, its amber eyes fixed on the elderly woman who waved from her porch, then vanished into the gathering darkness like a golden ghost returning to its eternal hunt. Was that one of them? Naya whispered, pressing close to her grandmother's side. One of their descendants, Kaya confirmed, feeling the familiar warmth pulse through her mother's turquoise bracelet. They still watch over us, just as we watch over the places they once called home. The sacred canyon remained protected, designated as a cultural preserve that no mining company or development project could touch. Officially, it was preserved for its archaeological significance, the petroglyphs and ancient artifacts that told the story of Apache spiritual traditions. Unofficially, it was guarded by spirits both human and feline, ensuring that future generations would have access to the wisdom of the cat people. As stars emerged in the desert sky, Kaya continued weaving her memory blanket, adding new symbols that represented hope, continuity, and the eternal dance between wild hearts and human consciousness. The story was far from over. It was simply entering its next chapter, carried forward by a new generation, ready to discover their own bridges between the worlds of matter and spirit. In the distance, a mountain lion's call echoed off the canyon. Walls, answered by another from the opposite direction. The ancient conversation continued, and somewhere in that wild music, the voices of Aicha and Itzan could still be heard by those who knew how to listen with more than human ears.